Today is February 5, 2024. My name is Rob Carr of Kalamazoo Right to Life, and this is Pro-Life Week. Well, I was looking at lifenews.com today, and I found a few interesting stories. And the first one, I was unaware of this, but Mark Houck, the Pennsylvania pro-lifer who was arrested by the FBI and tried for violating the FACE Act about a year and a half ago, was acquitted about a year ago. And he is running for Congress. And I had no idea. He's running for Congress. He is challenging the incumbent Republican named Brian Fitzpatrick in the 1st Congressional District in Pennsylvania, just outside, southwest of Philadelphia. Fitzpatrick is generally conservative and pro-life, but he did vote in favor of the Ensuring Access to Abortion Act of 2022. Well, why are we ensuring access to abortion, Mr. Fitzpatrick? Okay. Following the Dobbs ruling, he also said this, quote, any legislative consideration, that would be a state legislation, must always seek to achieve bipartisan consensus that both respects a woman's privacy and autonomy and also respects the sanctity of human life. These principles are not mutually exclusive, but both can and must be achieved, unquote. Well, in this current climate, when Democrats oppose even the slightest restriction or regulation regarding abortion, does Fitzpatrick really believe to see or expect to see bipartisan consensus on abortion? Maybe in his utopian world he can see it, but not in reality. Just look at our dear president, Joe Biden, who talked out of both sides of his mouth, stating categorically that he is in line with his faith in the sanctity of human life, or that life begins at conception. He believes in it. But then on the other side of his mouth, he will support or wants to codify Roe v. Wade. He will support abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy with no restrictions whatsoever. That is a two-faced person. But somehow Fitzpatrick thinks we can work with these people. We will see this summer in the Pennsylvania primary how Mark Houck does. But to unseat the incumbent, but we do need pro-lifers, pro-life champions in Washington. And he has earned my respect and trust. Okay, let's cross the pond here, back to Great Britain. I've talked before about this woman, Isabel Vaughan, who has been arrested 2 or 3 times for praying silently in front of an abortion clinic. But she's in violation of something called the Public Spaces Protection Order. No, there's a little buffer zone in front of these clinics, and you can't walk in front of the clinic, and as you're passing by, you can't pray silently, you can't hold a sign, you can't do anything. You can't do anything, you'll get arrested. Well, a Pastor Green, held up a sign from Psalm 139, verse 13, quote, for thou hast possessed my reins. I think it's a King James translation. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. Now, we know Psalm 139. Pro-lifers have been using Psalm 139 for decades, and it is very, very well known in Christian circles. It just is. It's not something, an obscure verse that we just kind of pulled out of nowhere. But the judge found him guilty. And here's what the judge said, quote, the extract of the psalm mentioning my mother's womb was an act of protest. There were less controversial verses you could have chosen to display. I can come to no other conclusion that the verse was an act of disapproval of abortion. Let me get my page here. An act prohibited by the Public Spaces Protection Order. Okay, the pastor is going to appeal the verdict. He's sentenced 1 year probation, but he has to pay a victim's surcharge, like to the abortion clinic, £26. But he has to pay court costs or legal fees of up to 2,400 pounds, which is the equivalent of 3,008 US dollars. So that's a pretty stiff fine for just holding up a sign that doesn't even use the word life or pro-life or abortion. It just basically said, what's it say here? You have covered me in my mother's womb. That is not derogatory or inflammatory or incendiary. But to the judge, it's a violation. Okay. So we've gone now from Great Britain, now let's cross the pond back to the U.S. I mentioned last week, 6 or 7 people were convicted of violating the FACE Act in a courtroom in Tennessee. And fighting to save lives. Our Justice Department wants to put them in prison for 11 years. And I saw too, we've had 350 churches and pro-life buildings and offices or pregnancy care centers vandalized. 350. And only 4 people have been charged by the Biden Justice Department. 4 people. Not a good track record, Joe. Okay. I'm going to go on a little history lesson here. I love history. Think back to the Fugitive Slave Act. After the Revolution, the Constitution was ratified. Slavery was protected, but it was outlawed in most of the northern states and protected in the southern states. Well, there were runaway slaves trying to get north to get freedom, and in 1793, Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act. If a person was a runaway slave, slave owners could hire people to go after you up into the northern states, capture you, bring them back. If you were found aiding and abetting a runaway slave, you were fined $500, which was a lot of money in 1793, and it's the equivalent of $15,500 in 2024 currency. But it was very unpopular in the North, and many, many people were violating that law, even with that fine. In 1850, Congress passed, it was part of the Compromise of 1850, they passed a second, stricter Fugitive Slave Act. This time, the penalties were stiffer. If you were aiding and abetting a runaway slave, you were fined $1,000 and 6 months in jail. Now, $1,000 in 1850 is the equivalent of $39,200 in 2024 dollars. So $39,000, that is a chunk of change. It is, at least it is to me. That was the penalty if you were just helping and hiding a runaway slave. And obviously the same provisions were held for the slave. You could chase after them, hunt them down, capture them, and bring them back to slavery in the South. But a stiff punishment if you were helping them. Okay. People involved in the Underground Railroad did so because they hated slavery and all the evil it represented. But our government was willing to punish those heroes who now we look at people like Harriet Tubman, who was an Underground Railroad runner. We look at these people as heroes today. And I pray that someday Americans will look at the Mark Houcks of this world, people who pray and fast and try to rescue babies and women from abortion clinics. Someday we will look at them as heroes defending the right to life of innocent unborn babies. Pro-life heroes try to save babies from destruction now, and our government intends to put them in prison. History repeats itself. Fugitive Slave Act then, the FACE Act now. The names have been changed, but the result is still the same. Righteousness is being stamped out upon, but we will still prevail. Maybe not on this earth, but we will when God calls us to glory. Okay, last item. I saw an article written by Dave Andrusko, who is the editor of the National Right to Life News. He's talking about a man named George Jonas, who wrote a piece in the Canadian newspaper, the National Post. This George Jonas is very pro-abortion, but he does see that some of the arguments that pro-abortion people make are flimsy at best. So I'm going to quote from this other man's article. Quote, "I don't necessarily oppose abortion. I oppose fuzzy thinking. I oppose arguments pro-choicers customarily use to support abortion. I find that flimsy at best and at worst, false." He gives some examples here. Pro-choicers argue, for instance, that society shouldn't interfere with what a woman does with her own body. Well, society doesn't. Society interferes with what she proposes to do with someone else's body. Few societies expect a woman to keep her baby if it's inconvenient for her. They only expect her not to kill it. Or, another example, there are those who say that, well, you can outlaw abortion, but women will just keep doing it in back alleys. I suppose on the same basis, we could legalize holdups, since people keep robbing banks anyway. Others argue that men shouldn't participate in the debate because they can't get pregnant, which is true. That's why I never rely on my credentials as a man in the abortion debate, only on my credentials as an ex-fetus, unquote. Okay, now this is from Andruszko. Jonas also has a brilliant critique on what he calls the essence of the feminist argument, granting women a 007 license to kill a la James Bond. But just because abortion isn't killing doesn't end the discussion. Now he's going back to this George Jonas. All societies, religious societies included, authorize individuals, sometimes classes of individuals, to kill for certain reasons. Judges, parents, police officers, ship's captains, inquisitors, soldiers, executioners, and others have been entitled to terminate human lives, provided they did so for compelling reasons. I actually believe the state has no business in the bedchambers of the nation, not even when they turn into death chambers. Unquote. So now back to Andruszko. I'm still scratching my head about the left turn, because that was a big pivot. First he was kind of saying how, well, the pro-life arguments are weak, but then he pivots back to this pro-choice position that a lot of groups have been involved in killing. So Andruszko says, I'm still scratching my head about the left turn. What constitutes compelling reasons? Outside the abortion context, what if cranky, exhausted parents in the middle of the night are awakened yet again by a crying newborn? Would we not want to step in to prevent the death of that child? How about a boyfriend who brutally beats his girlfriend? Is it enough to say in all these cases it makes you nervous about when the government steps in to protect the utterly vulnerable? Okay, now I'm going to finish here with a quote by this George Jonas. In ancient Sparta, parents used to toss their substandard children off a cliff. Spartan society had no use for physically infirm children. We find this shocking. Our preference is to kill healthy children through abortion. The year we appointed the late Dr. Henry Morgentaler to the Order of Canada for aborting unwanted fetuses was the year we released Robert Latimer after nearly a decade in jail for having killed his disabled daughter. Imagine a time-traveling spaceship of Spartan tourists discovering that in this destination, the natives jail parents for killing incurably sick children, but honor doctors who kill perfectly healthy children at their parents' behest. It's lucky Canada doesn't rely on time-space travel tourism from antiquity. Well, he's right about that. And I'm out of time. With that, I will let you go, and I will see you next time.